Joining me on today's episode of the Halliday Wine Companion podcast, presented by Langtons, is Michael Anderson, Head of Auctions and Secondary Market at Langtons. We're going to chat about the wine auction process, how to avoid buying a bung bottle, the best investment wines, how to nab a bargain, and rare and expensive collections. Welcome, Michael. Before we begin, I'd love if you could tell us a little bit about Langtons and the history of the auction house for people that might not know.
Langtons Auctions is one of those things that people have heard about and don't really know the backstory, and it's an interesting one because the technology has changed over the years that we've been around. So we started in 1988. Stuart Langton was the person who started it off. Stuart's no longer with the business, but he's still in the wine trade doing various bits. And I think the turning point was when Andrew Keyard became involved. That was a year later. And Andrew really set about changing the way the auction space looked in Australia. We were the first person to solely do auctions for wine. And Andrew really looked at how we could really dial up Australian wine. So he started that with the Langtons classification, which started in 1990. And it was all really about Australian wine at that point because, French wine was still, making amazing wines, but it was still in its infancy in this country. It was all about, local domestic product. Soon thereafter, Tamara Grishy started. So Andrew, Stuart, and Tamara really set about building this business. And as technology has changed, the space has changed as well. So online was a huge piece. But back in the olden days, you hear Tam talk about people faxing in their bids, people calling in their bids on phones, things that wouldn't be allowed now. We did live auctions back in the day as well, and we still do those. They're just not quite as large as they used to be, and now it's all online for us. Langtons also has the brokerage service and the online space for retail as well. So it's grown into this, from a really small auction house in Melbourne, and they had a presence in Sydney, to being this online fine wine, one-stop shop effectively for brokerage, retail, and auctions.
And what about your own personal journey with wine? How did you get into it, and was there like an aha moment where all of a sudden you were like, wow, this is awesome?
Yeah, it's a good question. I had a girlfriend back in the olden days whose parents owned a winery in the Hunter Valley. So we spent an inordinate amount of time in the Hunter Valley. We went up there every weekend. I live in Sydney, so the Hunter's the next closest wine region to me. A lot of boys' trips up there, bucks parties, weekends away, all those sorts of things were based around the Hunter, and it sort of got my interest there at a pretty young age. As luck would have it, my girlfriend and I broke up.
Boys trip and having a little semi on.
Exactly right. Yeah. Well, it's one of those things where it was always a bit weird having a glass of wine at the pub. So I always drank beer, but always had this love for wine. And it was really when I spent some time in Newcastle with my best mate's dad and his wine club. And we'd just drink with them, nothing expensive, just good Australian wine. With a bit of age on it, and we'd talk about it. And I think, the conversation became, more than just wine. It became about history and all the things that were happening around the time these wines were made. And from there, it sort of grew for me. Funnily enough, after my girlfriend and I broke up, a week later, I got a job in the wine trade. So, and then haven't looked back really. So it's been sort of, more than 15 years now.
Yeah, nice. And when did you join Langtons? And I guess what does a normal day look like for a head of auctions?
Yeah, it varies. I've been in the business now for almost 6 years, and a day in the life of me changes every day. It can be waking up early and going and meeting clients, vendors who want to sell their wine, looking through cellars with people, looking at storage facilities where their wines are, but I'm in the weeds as well, doing valuations and taking phone calls and doing all the things that brings in new business. From getting on planes and going and looking at books at a warehouse that we're about to start auctioning. I recently was up in Brisbane collecting and packing a cellar of really, really old Bordeaux that we're bringing into the business. And
sounds horrible.
Yeah, I mean, look, it is. It's my wife hates it because I leave her during school holidays to go and do fun things, but it's varied. No 2 days are the same, but the most important thing I do is just keep a rough eye on everything that's coming in. It's really important to know what the wines are that are coming in so you can find the right customers for them.
Yep. Okay, well, let's talk about the auction process. So if I've never bought wine at auction before, how does it work? What do I do?
Sure. So, I mean, it's all about knowing what you want before you get there. Otherwise, it can get very expensive very, very quickly. Going online, you'd go online to our website. It's always best to sign up straight away just so you can, bypass all of the rigmaroles of adding credit cards in and signing up later in the piece. It's better to just sign up straight away and you can start the bidding process. Some people use the filters to look for wines. Some people look at all 10,000 wines and go look at the pictures because they have plenty of time to do so. There's a lot of different ways to skin a cat with buying, but most people will go and find the thing that they want. The smarter ones have a budget in mind and they put their bid on and just walk away. Bidding is quite easy. It tells you exactly what's happening. You sort of look at the wine, you assess it, you make sure that you think the condition is needed to be for whatever purpose you have the wine for, or are buying the wine for rather. You put your bid on, you walk away. And then hopefully on Wednesday morning or Monday morning, you get an alert saying that you've won the bottle of wine that you intended to buy. So it's all very simple. It's literally a few clicks.
And did you say you do credit card info kind of later on?
When you sign up, it's always best to put your credit card straight in. It's just, once it's in there, it's in there.
I was going to say, how do have you ever encountered anyone kind of going, oh my God, I've accidentally bought 30 wines. Can't pay for them.
Yeah, there's been people who have tried. Unfortunately, our terms and conditions are pretty strict on that sort of stuff, only because it's, the process of buying an auction should be like buying a house at auction. There's a deposit that goes down. So it's just exposure levels that we don't really need. But the point is that, just have a budget is always the one thing that I say. And you've got to remember that, commissions come into it as well. The way that our bidding works, so if people don't know at home, is that if you put a bid in for $110 and the next highest bid is $100, you only pay $101.
Yeah.
So it's the model of only $1 more than the second highest bid. So, I always say to people, a gentleman recently came looking for a bottle of DRC. He had a budget. He put the highest number he had in and walked away. And he won it for $1 more than the second highest bid. So he was really happy that he saved a bit of money on one side and got the wine that he wanted without, waiting to the last 3 seconds of an auction to close, which can be quite stressful, I must say.
Yeah, imagine. So there's no limit to the amount of bottles that anyone can kind of bid on at any one time, or is there like a buy now option ever, or is it only sort of bidding?
So it's a really good question. Buy now has been something that we've been looking at, and other places around the world do have a buy now option. With ours, we like to go for pure market play, open market. So, bidding is competitive, gets a better result for our vendors. So we do have a buy now, but insofar as if you show interest in a wine whilst the auction's open, so if you go and click watch, there's a little watching button on the wine. If you go and click watching and it doesn't sell at auction, you have the opportunity for 24 hours after the auction closes to be first in, best dressed. So you can go click and buy it.
Yeah.
So long as you're the first person to do it.
Yeah, so everyone who's clicked watch has that option.
So there's 20 watches, 20 people have the option to go and buy it at reserve.
Okay, cool.
After the auction closes. And it was introduced about a decade ago to our business, and it really changed the way we did business, and helped people, because we don't like the buy now option while an auction's open, because we like the open market play there, but we don't mind, and our vendors don't mind selling it in 24 hours after it closes.
Yeah, right. Okay, that's good to know. And once a bidder has won, what's the process? Do you have the wines at Langtons and you send them out, or do you sort of put the two parties together and they sort it out?
No, we don't do the latter. We take every wine that we sell in. And there's a reason for that and the method to the madness. It's important that we see every bottle of wine that we're selling, just so we can keep an eye on them. We can look at the condition. Our team at the warehouse have an incredibly stringent, process of going through every single bottle, and that's why it costs us so much to handle these wines, because we look at them with lights and blue lights and look at anti-fraud and, check colour of wine, check cork, cap, everything that comes with wine to make sure that it is hunky-dory and perfect. That all happens at our warehouse level. So when you win, you can consolidate all your buys from the week or 2 weeks before, and then we ship it out to you whenever you need it. Basically, some go quicker than others. There's wine clubs out there who need a bottle right now, so you can move that for them quickly, or you can consolidate a bunch of different wins.
We've just sort of mentioned it a bit then, but do you have any tips for prospective buyers on assessing wine? I mean, I imagine that with live auctions, there's a bit more of an opportunity to kind of physically look at a product. What are you looking for, and what do you do to kind of ensure that a product is, or do you ensure a product's okay?
We do.
Is it still a bit of a gamble?
It's still a little bit of a gamble. I think secondary market is, but so's primary. I mean, you can go and buy a bottle of wine from vintage cellars, and it can be corked, and very few people are going to walk back and get their money back. So that's primary market, that's retail, and that's still a risk. So the secondary market does come with its risks, and the risks are that it's been in at least one other set of hands from the winery before it's gotten to yours. So with the condition piece, you're right. People just look at one photo often and go make a decision on that. They can rest assured that with my team, we have 7 receipters sitting at desks with all the tools under the sun to make sure wines look as good as possible. I've seen perfect bottles of wine from the outside. I said, why did you say no to that? Why are we sending that back to the owner? And the colour had dropped out. So they'd looked through the glass with their lights and they'd seen that the sediment was in the bottom. So however it was stored, the colour had dropped out of it. So, and they know their stuff. They've been doing this. A lot of them have been with us for a very, very long time. There's only so much you can look at from the outside before you open the bottle and see what the condition is. I always say the first place to look is the cap. Is the cork pushing or is it sunk? Is it hard? Corks push sometimes and that's okay. Cork sinks slightly, particularly with old wines, and that's okay. But if the cork's still firm, that's normally a good sign that the air hasn't gotten around it or that the wine hasn't sort of encroached into the cork itself. Outside of that, you just look at it for general tattiness. There's wines that are kept in damp cellars that are perfect, and the labels are all ripped. But you just make an overall play looking at the bottle condition, the cap, the cork, and the label. Label's probably not as important because, as I just said, there's people who keep their wines in caves. And so with that comes a general level of tattiness over 20, 30 years. You've got to remember that a label is a piece of paper.
Yeah.
And, you've seen what happens to a piece of paper that's just left anywhere for more than a couple of days. It starts getting dirty. So they're the general things I look for. We get lots of emails every week saying, can I have more photos? Can I have can you take a photo of the top of the cap, particularly for really high-end purchases? We always service that. I remember having a conversation at the Penfolds recorking clinics with a chap who called me out for having one photo of a 1951 Grange online. He said, if I'm going to spend $140,000 on a bottle, I'm going to need more than one photo. So now we take about 30 photos every time we get one in. And it was really good feedback, and he was actually 100% correct. So
that's so funny. What about things like fill level?
Yeah, fill level is important. Ullage is important.
Quickly, for people who might not know, what is ullage?
So ullage is basically the space between the top of the wine to the cork. So sometimes you'll see no ullage because the cap will be covering it, and sometimes you'll see just air between the wine and the cork, and that is what ullage is.
So it's a fancy way of saying fill level?
Basically, yeah.
Okay, cool.
I think ullage is really important to the Australian consumer, not so much to the European consumer.
Oh, why is that?
I think that there's some of the greatest wines I've had have been 6 or 7 centimetres ullaged. It's one of those things where you judge it once it gets to the glass when it comes to ullage. I've had some amazing bottles that have been leaking as well. So, wine's been coming out, but no air's been getting back in. I've had a couple of robust conversations with various vendors and customers over the years about ullage. I personally it doesn't concern. I mean, if it's half full, there's a problem going on, right? But, particularly with Burgundy bottles where they fill them in really, really cold cellars, and then once they leave that cellar, they expand. The wine expands, and so some of them leak. So people who have been collecting Burgundy for a long time know that the odd leak and the odd bit of ullage just means it's travelled from Burgundy to Australia. Ullage, in particularly old wines, is something that you can look for. I think that Burgundy bottles show ullage worse than Bordeaux's. But as I said, I've had well into the neck bottles of Penfolds and well into the neck bottles of into the shoulder bottles of Bordeaux and Penfolds that have been spectacular.
Do you ever allow prospective buyers to come and look at the bottle in person?
Absolutely. It's a process because our warehouse is in Melbourne. So if you're in Melbourne and you're looking to buy a set of Grange, for example, and we have the set there, we will set aside a space at the warehouse. We'll pull the wines out from the cage. We'll put them up and make sure someone watches you as you go through and have a look at them. I think it's important.
Yeah, for sure.
A set of Grange costs you a pretty penny these days, up at $400,000. So my brother paid less for his first apartment than that. So, it's important that you get a few looks. But we do it when we can. As I said, there's always the opportunity to have as many photos as you need to prove the point that a wine's looking good. But people are always welcome.
How do you kind of assess the market price for something? Like, how do you know what something is worth, and how does a buyer know what something is worth?
Yeah, I mean, for us, it's just believing that you have the richest data in the market, and we do. We sell so much high quality, brilliant wine at the moment that our data is just so rich, and we can only go by the last sale. And sometimes there's the odd sale that's way above the rest, and you have to go and look at why. Who was buying that? Did they need it for something very specific? We use our data for the most part. We do look at international trends as well, but Australia is a little bit slower in picking up certain trends internationally when it comes to styles of wine and prices. I think you'll find that DRC here is cheaper than DRC would be on the ground in France or London. So yeah. I mean,
good to know, maybe.
Marginally, it doesn't make it any more affordable, believe you me. But we use the data that we have. We've sold so much of these brilliant wines, for the amount that's actually made and the amount that comes into the country. So we look at our data as the starting point. And look, customers and vendors are a different story altogether. They're brilliant. So many of our vendors are really cluey, excellent collectors. They really know what they're doing. But Wine Searcher is a big piece that people use. And Wine Searcher is an amazing tool. I sat down with the team from Wine Searcher in London when I was there doing some work. And they have this data set, just the amount of data that goes through and the people who are searching their website. They're an aggregator of what's for sale as opposed to what's sold. So I've had a lot of texts saying, Michael, you valued my bottle of Rousseau at $3,000. I see that Wine Searcher have it for $7,000. I want that price. Yeah. And the conversation always moves to, that's the price for sale in another country. Yeah. And just because it's for sale doesn't necessarily mean it's going to sell. I prefer to look at the data with things that have actually sold, particularly in the local market. So there's a little argy-bargy every now and again on that, but it's always, really polite. But what's out there online for sale doesn't necessarily mean that's the price that a wine is, if that makes sense.
And what sort of wines do people tend to buy at auction? Are they buying only rare and expensive wines, or are they buying like midweek quaffers?
It's a vast mix. It's a vast mix. I mean, and I've got a gentleman at the moment who is only buying Loire, DRC, and Rousseau. So he's narrowed that down to 3 Burgundian producers that he's really, really keen on buying, which is fabulous. But a lot of people just come and buy a little bit of everything. So they, birth year wines for their kids, and whilst they're there, they'll pick up a nice bottle of Burgundy for themselves. They're pretty vast in terms of what people are. At the moment, Burgundy is really popular, and there's still a couple of reasonably priced names out there that people can pick up. Most of the time, people are going for back vintage. People love back vintage wines. The times that we see newer vintages selling, it's for new budding collectors coming to get a good deal on the more recently released wines, which is what you generally get at auction, because obviously it takes a little bit of time for a price to increase on something. But honestly, it's so eclectic in terms of what people are buying. You see baskets that are 1 bottle of whiskey, 4 bottles of red and 6 bottles of white, and you just think that they're just covering all bases there for themselves and their family, I think. It's eclectic as.
And I imagine you'd have lots of people, who weren't able to cellar at home because they didn't have the space or anything, and they just want to have, be able to drink some older wines. And
it's a really good point, and it's a point that I talk about regularly with the team, is that houses are getting smaller. I know how big my house is in Sydney, and it's not big enough for a wine cellar. So people are looking for alternatives, whether or not it's off-site storage or it's buying the wines that they need for the month and going from there. And I think there's been a real trend and a push to less and better in terms of how people drink. Yeah. I think the world's getting a little bit more expensive, and you get a lot of doctors telling people, you should probably scale back your drinking. So instead of drinking 3 bottles of $20 red, they're coming for 1 bottle of $45 red, which is fantastic, which is, really increasing their aptitude in wine and drinking better wines, I think is fantastic. But I think the space thing is really important. I think that we have people just shipping a box every month just because they haven't got the space, but they can put the whites in the fridge amongst the food and keep the red somewhere cool until they drink it, which I think is a really smart way of doing it.
And do you have any tips for, in terms of grabbing a bargain or anything like that? Is there anything any sort of varieties or styles that you can get for a cheaper price, or, off vintages?
I think that, bargains are hard to come by in any market at the moment. I think people looking for a great Chardonnay can find really good Aligoté from Burgundy if that's what you're looking for. It's like a watered down version of Chardonnay in a lot of ways, and there's some really good producers out there producing that grape. I think that in the new world there's some really great bargains. South Africa and Chile are offering some really clean wines at a really reasonable price. Bargains in terms of the bigger styles like the top Burgundies. The value is in the eye of the beholder, right? It's how much. It's all relative if you've got the money. But I think Australia are producing such incredible wines at the moment. I think that the amount of Chardonnay being produced here at a high level is fantastic. Shiraz is obviously the thing that put us on the map, but Grenache is probably the future in a lot of ways. I think it'll be a tiny portion of the trade, but the Grenache being produced in Australia is such a good alternative style.
Yeah, we are very much all about Grenache at Halliday at the moment.
Yeah, absolutely.
I've been for a little while now, but it's just outstanding.
It ticks every box. It's it's the reason that Italian varieties have gone so well is because they offer that lighter style, and then Grenache, obviously not from Italy, but Grenache just offers that. You've got texture, it's got volume, it's got fruit, it can age, and it's got a bit of history to it as well. You can go back and look what the Rhone did with Grenache, and I just think McLaren Vale is pretty much where I started my journey outside of New South Wales, and the alternatives being produced there are fantastic.
Yeah, absolutely agree. We've touched on this a little bit, but generally speaking, what is the secondary market like at the moment? Is it kind of is it growing, or is it?
Secondary market, I mean, if you look around and look at just the retail, you always compare retail and primary to secondary. So it's probably the best place to start. You look around at the primary market, and I think people have been doing it quite tough over the last 12 months in terms of selling wine hand to hand at wine shops and online. There's a multitude of reasons, mostly because the world is quite expensive at the moment. Shopping is more expensive, food's more expensive, interest rates are higher. So the primary market's been struggling a little bit, but auctions always seems to be impervious to those sorts of things, because a lot of our buyers, our clients, our customers, they don't really have mortgages. They've got plenty of money, so and they just want the finest and rarest piece. And if it's slightly more expensive, then again, it's all relative. But the secondary market's doing really well. We're really pleased with where we're at. We've got a great plan for the year ahead. It was a little bit slower last year than the previous two, but the previous two were both record years, year on year. So we're really pleased with where our plan is in the secondary market in general. I also do buying, so secondary market buying. So obviously I have the auction part of my job, and I failed to mention this in the first question, but I buy secondary market parcels as well. So if you have 1,000 bottles of Penfolds Grange that you want to sell, but you don't want to take them all to auction because it might spoil the market for a while, we can buy those as well, and we do that negotiation and deal.
And then what do you do with them? Do you then not just
give them
them out, or
give them to our PCMs?
Sorry, what's a PCM?
So they're private client managers. So we used to call them brokers, but we sort of moved away from that term, and we're it's all one-to-one service now at that level. So they're private client managers. And then look, I'm mostly dealing with big businesses who have taken position on a large amount of a piece of stock. And as we just talked about, businesses have been doing a little bit tough. So there's that piece as well. And that's part of my job, and that's the secondary market. And that's really been dialed up recently. I've been offered a lot of wine from a lot of pub groups and retail sellers of high-end wine. Not all of them come off. Everyone has a price that they need to recoup. But there's been some wonderful deals being found in that space at the moment.
How does supply and demand kind of work in the secondary market? Is it there's always enough wine, but what people are looking for changes, and there might be ebbs and flows, as we've sort of just mentioned. Burgundy's obviously becoming rarer and more expensive, but yeah, are you finding that there's customers are getting what they look for, what they want?
Yeah, I think so. It's cyclical. It goes round, and when the market's a little bit tougher and people are finding life a little bit more expensive, they often look to their cellar to go and sell a few things to sort of fill the coffers with cash. So it just means that there's more wine available in tough times, and there's also more wine available when the times are good, because you're getting a better return on your wine. We have certain people that we go to when we need certain pieces, big collectors who I know like to rationalise every now and again for various reasons. So we always try and keep the supply as steady as possible. You don't want too much of something either. I think that just kills the market a little bit in terms of bidding and value return for the vendor. Look, summer's always a great time for bidding. We get lots of bidding. People are really up and about it being warm, and the fact they can go out and drink with their friends and have barbecues and those sorts of things. But I've got 3 or 4 vendors who refuse to send me wine during the summer months because they think it's too hot, even though we can completely manage the relationship and make sure the wine is looked after. But generally, it's pretty smooth in terms of how we like the stock to come in and the levels in which we like to sell between all regions and styles. And we space it out. So if someone gives me 24 bottles of Giaconda Chardonnay, I don't know how they got 24 bottles of Giaconda Chardonnay, so that might be a bad example, but say they had 24 bottles of Giaconda Chardonnay, We would space that out.
Yeah.
Just because, I'd take that over 2.5 months and try and sell it there because it's a better return and it's also better for the customers to not just have to sort of compete for that many wines.
For sure. Well, that's a good segue into investment wines. Is it common practice for people to buy wines purely with intent to resell rather than drink?
Yeah, I think like anything that's a market-based activity, speculators are pretty rife. The thing about wine is it's not, and I talk about this with my friends who are in the markets, the finance side of the markets, and they always get jealous that they actually enjoy the part that I do. Numbers don't really, excite them all that much, but wine excites me. So it's one of those things where most people are wine lovers to begin with. There's not many pure speculators who don't love wine that come out and try and buy wine to sell it, because you actually have to have a pretty good understanding of the wines that you're buying as well. To stay ahead of trends and to make sure you're not buying a complete rip-off of a wine that, won't necessarily make you money. I would say the vast majority, 95% plus of people are wine lovers at heart. But they get to a point where they've bought a 3-pack of DRC Echezot, and, they always tell me, Danny Eunice was the best at telling me this when I sold his cellar. He said it tasted great at $500. And it was pretty good when it got to $1,500. But now that it's at $4,500, I just have to really think about who I'm opening the bottle with and if they're worth it. And it makes total sense. If you're opening a bottle of wine that you spent $300 on, but now is worth $4.5 or $5, every time you drink that wine, you're probably being a little bit hard on the wine.
Seeing the dollar signs.
Yeah, and thinking, that's a, family car. When you drink really high-end wines, and is it worth it? And that's not what wine should be about. Wine should be really enjoyable.
Well, there's so many great wines at, much more affordable price points than that.
Yeah, I mean, you can go into any Dan Murphy's and find an incredible bottle of wine for $25 and under. And it's just the fact that we live in this country that has no real rules on what you can produce and the grapes that you can produce and make wine from. So there's just so many options.
Yeah. Are there any producers or regions or styles that make better investments than others?
Yeah, I think, I was going to say Burgundy, but I don't know if it's just topped at the moment. Burgundy is so expensive.
Is it going to keep growing?
Yeah, and it will. And I'll tell you why. It's because if you look at Bordeaux in 2010, and God, I wish I had Mr. Kayard here to really guide me on the pricing. But if you look at Bordeaux around 9 and 10, and then into 15 and 16, when they were talking about it, being these amazing best ever vintages, they had the series of best ever vintages they had was incredible. The prices really shot up thanks to what the Chinese market were doing, buying those wines. And the wines are incredible, like no bones about it. Cabernet is arguably the greatest grape on earth. But they produce so much of it. Latour, for example, can just go down the road and buy another vineyard and start making that as their top wine. Whereas in Burgundy, it's a plot with a wall. And there's probably 20 owners of those 100 rows. So you can only ever make that same number, with slight variance given weather and all the things that come with working and living in Burgundy. So those prices will continue. They have to continue. It's all about fads and trends. It's all about producers producing amazing wine there. And I'm not saying that Bordeaux doesn't. Some of the greatest wines I've ever had have been Bordeaux, but they produce I think in 2000, don't quote me on this, I had a bottle of 2000 Latour, so I was doing a bit of research into it. I think they produced 22,000 cases.
Yeah, okay. And
then when you go and look at someone producing in Burgundy, who has, or someone in Champagne who has 0.64 of a hectare, producing Krug, that's not much. That's, a football field. So, and that's all they can produce. So those prices will maintain just purely on supply and demand.
And I guess especially in Champagne, then you got to factor in all the time that it actually takes to make it. And
oh God, yeah. I was in Champagne with my wife, and everyone, we talk about the number crunchers at champagne houses being really stressed all the time because they know they've got tens of millions of euros worth of wine sitting in their cellars that they just refuse to sell yet. I'm more about selling things, moving through things quickly so people can enjoy them, whereas they just like to hold them, which is fine.
And Langtons will also, that you have a storage service, right? So I can buy a wine and you can hold on to it and then I can just resell it.
Correct. So
and I've never even seen that wine, but I've made hopefully some money off it.
Yeah, I mean, we had a gentleman do just that, and I'll tell you about that in a moment. We do have a storage service. So, back in the day, people were leaving wines for us, and we were okay with it for the most part. And then we sort of looked at the numbers and we thought, no, we actually let's just go best in market at the storage price, and it's a very small amount per bottle to keep it with us. And we thought it's just better to, because it means that we insure it and we look after it for you and all those different things that come with it. Our storage service isn't like a wine arc storage service where you can come in and self-serve and those sorts of things. It's just a pure, hey, if you haven't got the space, we'll keep 3 or 4 boxes for you, climate controlled, and make sure they're looked after until you either need them, at which point we can send them to you, or if you do like to sell them again, we will sell them again. It's definitely something we're looking at, I think, because as we just talked about before, space is at a premium at the moment for most people of our generation. So,
what about any kind of surprising sales, any bottles that's gone well above what you're expecting or, well under? I
think well above was the thing I touched on before and never told the story. I remember like the light bulb moment that I was in this space that can really change quickly. I had a bottle of Davenay, so Leilou Bees-Loise, so the part owner of DRC and a wine producer in her own right, one of the greatest wine producers in the world. A bottle of her second label, Davenay, came through auction. It was a Chardonnay from 2005, I believe. And it came through and it sold at $4,000. And that was in the first month that I was working with the business. And I thought, that's a lot for a Chardonnay. I remember having a conversation with my boss, Tam, at the time. And I drink wine for vibrancy and freshness. I do love old wines. Old wines are fabulous. But particularly with Chardonnay, I just love vibrancy and freshness. And I thought, that's a lot for an older bottle of Chardonnay, but obviously it's so rare. It was Grand Cru, I think it was Croix Batard Montrachet or something along those lines. And the gentleman never actually collected it. He just left it with us it was about 18 months, I think. And then he asked me to put it back up at auction. And it sold for 24 grand.
Wow.
So he made $20,000 in almost no time.
Without even seeing the wine.
Without even touching the wine. And it was just this incredible result. And I remember looking at it, just thinking, I should have bought that bottle of wine. But no one knew what that wine was going to do. And it was when DRC and Loire and those sort of big name producers in Burgundy really started hitting this stratospheric level after people had sort of cooled a little bit on Bordeaux, and it was incredible. Like I'd never seen anything quite like it. In terms of low numbers, look, there's always a bottle where it only gets one bid because it hides in amongst these amazing wines. There's so many wines out there. Nothing that springs to mind in that regard. There's some great deals to be had.
Yeah.
Oh, there's some great, particularly on back vintage wines. If you are willing to take a risk on something a little bit older, from a good producer, like some of the Brokenwood wines from back in the sort of early 90s, they're just, for the prices that you're paying for them, if the ullage is good and the label is good and you're happy with the condition, I always say take a punt.
Yeah,
Secondary market.
Noticed a few of those in James Halliday's collection, which you just sold.
Yeah, James had a few of those. James, we've obviously sold James's collection a couple of times now. And the most recent seller for James was actually an interesting one because we thought we'd never do any more of James's wines after the one before. So about 5 years ago. But these were all the wines that James really intended to keep.
Yeah.
And that was the idea. And obviously he's not drinking as quickly as he used to. So these wines were actually a really interesting look at James's collecting and in terms of what he wanted to keep. Obviously, the one before was a bunch of stuff that he'd bought over the years and been given from friends and stuff like that. But
all the DRC.
All the DRC, exactly. But these ones were really interesting. Things weren't overly expensive. They were just brilliant snapshots of what was happening in the wine market at the time.
It did look like a very personal collection when I was looking at it.
It was. And it was a look at, the one before was his DRC. Everyone was after his DRC. This time round, and we had this conversation with James, it was about Rousseau for him.
Yeah.
Rousseau and DRC are the two red Burgundy producers or Burgundy producers that everyone talks about sort of being them versus them. And in a lot of ways, they're actually quite different. But the Rousseaus did really, really well. And yeah, there's a couple more actually that we've held back that we're putting up for auction soon. So we're excited by that.
When it does come time to resell those wines or any wine, if I came to you and said, Michael, I've got, 6 wines I want to sell. And we have touched on this a little bit, but what is the process, from the selling side of things like?
So I always say to people, get a valuation first so you know what you're looking at.
Is that through you or is
that's through us, yeah.
Okay.
So we've only got a 3-person.
Do you have to do that?
You don't have to, but it's nice to know what you're looking at, I think, and it sort of saves the conversations later about a client saying to me, I think my wine's worth this. And I say, well, I think the data suggests it's worth this. Just to avoid those conversations, which are always pleasant, but it's just nice to, take that day or two that it takes, depending on how big the valuation is, and get that valuation from my team. We're a small team, 4 people, but they're all wine professionals at heart, and they're really, really smart wine people. So we churn those out for customers. And then we have the conversation. Okay, so you've got this much wine. This is how I think we can sell it for you, whether or not it's a single vendor. So say you come to me and you have an incredible collection of 1,000 bottles that's quite eclectic, some old, some new, various regions. We could do a worldwide single vendor. And the single vendor piece is interesting because people kind of, particularly in the wine space, love to look inside people's cellars and see what they've got. And then it's coming from one place. And it's not guaranteed by us, but we've been there and we've checked the cellar out and we've done all the due diligence that we generally look at. So there's the valuation piece, then the sort of talking about how we're going to sell it piece. Then we come and collect the wine. Our team will come and collect it. We ask the vendors to pack it just because we like to put that piece on them. Sometimes we help if it's, different circumstances. We come and collect it. We take it to our warehouse. The team I spoke about before, the receipting team, they go through every bottle. That's probably the longest process. It takes a couple of weeks to go through, look at everything. We mark up on the sheet what the ECDs are, the extra catalogue descriptions. Mm-hmm. So stained label, chipped something, whatever it may be. We list it all out so the potential customer can see what the condition of the wine is.
Yep.
Then we put it into an auction. We find the auction that suits. We've got every 2 weeks we launch new auctions and there's always something open. So if you're looking at a bottle that's over $250 from Burgundy, it'll probably go into our finest and rare auctions, which is where our avid customers know to come and find the best and the brightest. We have our classification auction. So as I touched on before, the classification is something that Andrew, Kayard and Tam produced back early 90s. We recently did the roadshow around the country and had thousands of people turn up to taste the top 100 wines in the country. And they're the most traded wines. So that's all data that we use. So if you bring me a bottle of G Conde Chardonnay or a bottle of Grange, it'll go into that auction, which is probably our most popular auction. And then there's various other different auctions. WA has one, South Australia, Shiraz sometimes gets its own Chardonnay, or you can be a single vendor as well.
And when would you reject a wine? When would you say no?
I leave that to the team because you don't want to step on anyone's toes, and the receipters are incredible at our business. We would reject it if the cork was moving or there was visible signs of leaks, and we put the wines through what's called a leak test. So if it is leaking, doesn't necessarily mean it's game over for that wine. We can look at it and make sure that it's still in good nick and good condition. As I said, some of the greatest wines I've ever had have been leaking, but dried up. If a client comes to me and says something silly like, hey, just got this cellar from my grandma and it was kept in her kitchen for 35 years, then it's a really polite conversation around thanks but no thanks. And there's tells, right? There's tells. So if you send us a consignment of 10 boxes and there's obvious tells and you're a new customer, new vendor, we look a bit more strenuously at those tells. And we do it all the time. Every single week, there'll be multiple bottles that we just say thanks but no thanks. And it's not an ugly conversation. It's more hey, we'll just send this back and you can enjoy it. But we can't take the risk on it because it's our name.
You must have handled some truly incredible collections and bottles in your career. Do you have any stories you can share about, these amazing collections?
Oh, yeah. I mean, the poor lady who looks after the insurance piece for my business is sick of getting emails from me saying that I'm going in my private car to collect a $150,000 bottle of Grange. She's so over it. Obviously, everything's insured, but we need to get it made sure that we talk to the right people before we move wine. I've moved personally, driven to collect 3 or 4 bottles of Grange 51. I put it in the front seat with a seatbelt on, in a box, with bubble wrap and all that sort of stuff. I put it sidewards, so it doesn't have the front-back movement. It's only so I've moved multiple bottles of 51, which would be the most expensive bottles that I've moved. I mentioned a gentleman called Danny Eunice before, I can talk about him because Danny was a face-out auction, which means he let people know who's doing his auction. Most people are private about their auctions, which is something that we hold very dear to ourselves at Langtons. But Danny went face-out. Danny and I sat in his cellar, at his cellar space, which he rents. I think it was for 6 days over a long weekend. My wife was furious at me because I was sitting there and we were cataloguing every single wine. And he sent us 5,000 bottles, I think, in the end.
Yeah, wow.
And Danny's a real wine person. Like, he's probably the most educated wine person you'll ever meet. He's a wonderful chap. And every 10th or 11th bottle, Danny had a story about the wine. So we'd be sitting there and I'd be on my computer freezing cold in a big jacket, sitting on this little table that I'd bring along. That was probably the biggest collection. That took days and days and days. But it was the most successful auction we've ever done. So it was worth every penny.
Yeah, right.
Every bit of time, rather.
Have you ever had any experience with kind of fake or fraudulent bottles, you know, in the vein of Billionaire's Vinegar?
Yeah, I've seen that and I've read I'm actually doing my wine fraud course at the moment, which is really interesting.
Didn't even know that existed.
No, it does. Maureen Downey, who's a wonderful human who actually found a lot of the fake wines from Rudy Kernewine back in the olden days when he got caught. She was the sort of expert there. I'm doing that at the moment and it's good. It's really interesting. And look, there's a lot of fake wines in Europe and America and there's probably quite a lot in Australia as well. But I just, it's not quite as bad as it's made out to be. We have seen wines that come in that I had a bottle the other day where it was a bottle of Penfolds and the gentleman had cleared his cellar out and it was a friend had put a label that looks like Penfolds on the front, like he'd printed it off his computer and put Penfolds on it because he was making, the guy's name was Ben.
Yeah.
And he didn't mean to put it in, but I called him up and I said, mate, this is, oh mate, can you send that back to me? That's actually just a bottle. And it had a screw cap. It obviously wasn't anything near. So that was pretty funny. But in terms of the fake side of things, we've pulled a few bottles out over the years that you look at and go, it's just not right for us. Yeah. You do a bit of due diligence and we have all the measures that we take and we're still not 100%. So we just, we can't destroy it. We're not allowed to, but we just talk to the vendor and say, hey, listen, I don't know where you got this from originally, but we can't deal with this because, it's my name. It's Langton's name. So we're really, really strict on that. The team are really, really well trained. We've got thousands of historical photos of what correct looks like. We have pretty good lines in with wineries all around the world. And we leverage those relationships and make sure that everything's hunky-dory. But again, there's certain wines, Henri Jailleux is a tough one because the winery doesn't exist anymore. So you can't call up the winery and ask. That's a tough one. And, particularly after Rudy played around in that space, particularly in the 50s wines in Burgundy, and there's no real telling unless you go and carbon date the paper. So we just try and stay away from those old wines if we can. It's not going to make or break the business. And I'd prefer our customers and our vendors to be happy. All
right, I'm going to finish with a few just quick fire questions.
Sure.
If you could go back in time and put away one wine as an investment, what would you put?
Can I say one brand?
Yes.
DRC, just because of the prices that they're currently achieving. A few $100.
How far back would you have to go to make it worth it?
Oh, you go into the 80s. You go into the 80s. If when I was born, so I go into the 80s and speculate there and then sell half, drink half and buy a house. Honestly.
Many houses,
yeah,
probably.
buy the whole range as well because they're all done so well.
Where's your favourite place to drink wine? Like, what's your favourite bar?
Favourite bar is a place called El Camino. It's actually in Palma in Mallorca, which is where my wife's family had a house. And we have been lucky enough to be there a few times and it's always sherry when we go to El Camino. It's an amazing place.
What's your favourite variety or style?
Chardonnay.
What are you drinking most of at the moment?
Chardonnay.
Is there a bucket list wine and one you're desperate to try that you haven't?
Yeah, Loire Mussini. I've been lucky. I've done these events for the last couple of years for the business in which I host with a gentleman called Dave Bicknell. And I drink incredible wines, DRC, Loire, all of them. But Loire Mussini is the one that I haven't tried yet. And it's expensive, so I don't know if I ever will.
Favourite wine region?
Good question. This is supposed to be quick. Sorry. Burgundy.
Do you have any wine guilty pleasures?
Yeah, sherry.
It's not a guilty pleasure, unless it's creamed.
Yeah, no. Oh, you mean in terms of richness?
No, just in terms of I wouldn't probably admit this to my wine-loving friends, but I really enjoy
rosé. Rosé. I don't drink it out and I don't drink it around too many people. But gosh, rosé, when the sun's out in the afternoon, like a big glass as well. Yeah, I'm normally pretty judicious with my pours to make sure it's all the right temperature.
Well, if you're drinking DRC,
Yeah, exactly. Well, someone's judicious with my pours. But if the sun's out, absolutely. Rosés for not particularly, Australia make wonderful rosés, but Provençal rosés, incredible stuff. With texture. It's got texture. How can it have texture?
Thank you so much, Michael. Before we finish, where can we find you? Social media? Where are you?
You can find, I'm on the Langtons account every now and again, and we'll feature there. I have my private account, but it doesn't feature too much wine these days, mostly family stuff. But you can find me at the Langtons auctions website as well, and the email address there. If you ever need anything, you come and talk to us. We're a small team, and we're very one-to-one with our service.
And do you have anything to plug? Any events coming up? Anything you're working on?
We're working with Tyson, actually, coming up with the Champagne events, which is going to be really exciting. We're doing Brisbane, Sydney and Melbourne. I think Champagne is just incredible in the space it's in at the moment. I think value for money. I know it's expensive, but value for money, I think it's incredible. And Tyson does a great job of showing the folks around some of the great champagnes of the world. And we are kicking off our events again, which is, a pretty pricey little experience. But if you want to drink DRC, Loire, Coast-Duree, or all those wonderful wines in the one place, you can get involved in that. They'll all be online.
Thank you so much for joining me.
Thank you so much for having me. Cheers.
Thanks for listening to the Halliday Wine Companion podcast. If you enjoyed this episode, subscribe so you never miss one. Love it? Leave a review and share it with friends. For more, visit winecompanion.com.au or follow us on Instagram @winecompanion.